Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. It is the second CAVE show that we host. I'm Marta Santos. I'm a Science Communication Officer at the Center for Ecology, Evolution and Environmental Changes in Portugal. It's the CE3C, and it organizes the CAVE show, a series of webinars that take place within the International Year of Caves and Karst, which is organized by the International Union of Speleology, of which we are partners. During the webinar, you can leave your questions on the YouTube live chat on your right on the screen, and we will ask those questions to our invited speaker after our presentation. We'll have some minutes for Q&A. And I will now give the floor without further delay to the person that is responsible for this idea of the CAVE show, Ana Sofia Reboleira. She's a researcher at C3C, and she's the responsible for the CAVE show. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the second edition of the CAVE Show, a series of online seminars about cave science and also about our passion for caves. This event is hosted by myself and by Professor Stein Erik Lauritzen from the University of Bergen in Norway. I am thrilled and honored to present our edition today about bats, the iconic inhabitants of caves. Given today's subject, we have a special guest with us, Professor Jorge Palmeirim from the University of Lisbon in Portugal. Professor Palmeirim studies bats for more than 45 years and has mentored and is an inspiration for many bats and also cave researchers, and will now present our guest.
George, we can't hear you, sorry.
It only happens 90% of the time. Well, greetings to all. It's a great pleasure, a great personal pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Maria João Pereira. And it's a personal pleasure because I was the supervisor of her PhD, which she finished about 10 years ago. She did a great project in the Amazon on the ecology of Amazonian bats. And while she was in Brazil, she got infected with the Brazilian bug. And because she was infected with the Brazilian bug, she returned and she became an academic at the University of Rio Grande do Sul, the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, where she's an assistant professor, and she coordinates a research group on birds and mammals, both evolution and systematics and ecology laboratory. And at the same time, she coordinates the postgraduate program on animal biology. She continues doing great work with bats, mostly in Brazil, not only with bats, but mostly with bats and mostly in Brazil. And she actually became, in these very few years of her career, one of the most respected researchers in the ecology of South American bats. Finally, it's worth mentioning that she maintains a link to the Portuguese speleologist world, and she's a member of the Scientific Council of the Portuguese Federation for Speleology. She's a very good speaker, so enjoy the talk and the great work that she has done. Thank you very much for your attention. João, whenever you want.
Thank you, George. Let me just share my screen. Here, and here. So, can you see all right? Is everything okay? Great. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as Ana Sofia said. It's a huge pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Ana Sofia and the CAVE Show, for this very kind invitation. Thank you, Marta, for all the technical support you're giving us. It's a pleasure to represent my university here today and the Brazilian Bat Research Society, and to talk about bats, and particularly the bats of Brazil and of South America. But it was even more wonderful to be welcomed by my mentor, Jorge Palmeirim, there are no words to express everything that he taught me. I was one of his students for many, many years. We worked a lot in bat biology, ecology, conservation, but not only in biodiversity conservation further than bats. For many years, we worked together at Liga para a Proteção da Natureza, of which George is again the president. And what I want to thank the most is probably the most important part is the laughs that we shared in many moments, especially during fieldwork, often going or coming from caves. So thank you very much, George, for your words. It's great to be here, and in the context of 2021, the International Year of Caves and Karst, it certainly makes sense to talk about bats, as Ana Sofia said, the most iconic inhabitants of caves. And it's an excellent opportunity to talk about these incredible animals because they are often misunderstood and lately unfairly linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, in this hurry to point out a culprit for COVID-19, bats, pangolins, snakes, and other animals have ended up being held responsible for something for which they are not directly responsible. And in the case of bats, which I know a little bit better, the consequences have been very harmful, especially for a group that already enjoyed and fairly unjustly a bad reputation in the eyes of the general public. And cases of harassment and destruction of bat roosts and in caves and bat populations in other roosts increased in 2020, and mostly at the beginning of the pandemic. And such acts have very serious consequences for the conservation of this group, for the conservation of their roosts, including caves, and in a way that affects us very directly on the services that bats provide to us humans. And today, as this is the cave show, I expect to be talking to a group of people without a lot of misconceptions or prejudices towards the fauna of the dark, the fauna of night and caves. And the truth is that bats are not only restricted to caves. And if any of us here thinks that she or he doesn't live near bats or that their life has nothing to do with them, other than this misinformation associated with this disease, well, think again and let's stay tuned. First of all, let me talk to you about bat diversity, which is my main area of expertise, which I learned from George mostly. And bats are incredibly diverse and distributed in every continent except in the polar regions and a very few remote oceanic islands. Indeed, bats are everywhere and they are a lot. And when I say a lot, I'm talking of over 1,400 species and going up every day, every week, every month, new species are being described. And these species are extraordinarily diverse in terms of their ecology. Of course, when we think of bats, we think of caves. And when we think of caves, inevitably, we think of bats. Bats do love caves. But while a significant percentage of the species of bats across the world use underground roosts almost exclusively, many others have adapted to distinct roost types. And let's look at them. For example, many human-bat conflicts result from the fact that a lot of bat species has adapted to living in human-made infrastructures, including our buildings, our basements, our attics, or even window blinds. And in these images, you can see some examples of what we call synanthropic bat species, meaning that their ecological strategies are somehow associated with humans and human-altered environments, mainly cities or rural areas. Unfortunately, despite these drawbacks brought by the coronavirus-related misinformation, this relation between humans and bats is not always negative. And in some cases, it's almost symbiotic. One nice example, and probably one of the most notorious, is the case of the Brazilian free-tailed bat colony that roosts in the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, in Texas. And in the early 80s of the last century, a renovation transformed this bridge into an ideal bat roost. and attracted migrating Brazilian free-tailed bats. And now, 40 years later, the Austin's bat numbers have increased a lot, and locals and tourists have adopted these now beloved creatures as neighbors who provide an amazing night show, as you can see in that picture. And it has even led to the creation of the Austin Bat Fest, which is a music, food, and culture festival. Another good example, and because I'm Portuguese, I decided to bring this couple of pictures, is the positive coexistence between humans and bats that roost in the two world famous libraries, the Joanina Library at University of Coimbra and the Library of the Palace of Mafra. And the bats that roost inside these libraries emerge at dusk, and they eat moths, flies, and other insects that may be harmful for those invaluable books, ancient books that these libraries harbor inside. And before they go out the windows or the door and in search of water and additional food outside. But bats also use more ephemeral roosts, roosts that don't last that long. And particularly here in the neotropical region, which is the Central and the South America, we find a few species of bats that roost in leaves, in vegetation leaves. And some bats, as those on the left part of your screens, I hope it's the left part, are best known for their unique behavior of making tents out of large leaves. What they do is that they bite through the midrib or vein of a large leaf so that it folds over into an inverted V-shaped shelter. And they prefer usually banana and palm leaves. And so bats roost under those leaves, which provide protection against wind, against the sun, against the rain, sometimes against predators as well. And a single leaf may be used by several bats, from small groups to groups of a few tens of individuals. Of course, these roosts don't last that long, so they may use a roost for a couple of months at the most. And those white ones, which are very famous, are the Honduran white bats. And for many years, researchers didn't know how their groups organized. But recently, colleagues from Costa Rica have shown that this species is a truly communitarian species, and that non-related males and females join in small colonies, and they all the individuals of the colony work towards building their tents, and that they also forage together. Other species, as that you can see on the right, are known as disc-winged bats. And they have, at the base of their thumbs and ankles, disc-shaped suction cups that they use to cling to the inside of the leaves in which they roost. And it's also an amazing mechanism, because these suction structures are controlled by very fine muscles, and a single one of these discs is enough to support the entire weight of the bat. So as you can see, you have a lot of different roosts, but one of the most incredible adaptation is one that we find here in the neotropics. And this adaptation is presented mostly by bats of the genus that's in that picture, known as the round-eared bats of the genus Lophostoma, and that they roost in active termite nests. And recently, one of who is now my master student, Diego Esquivel, and who's from Colombia, and several collaborators, including my dear colleague Valéria Tavares from the Brazilian Bat Research Species List Committee, they published a revision of this behavior in bats. And roosting inside this termitaria can offer many advantages for bats, such as protection against predators, a suitable and stable microclimate, similar to what we find in caves. So as you can see, bats are distributed all across the world, and they are able to occupy many different roost types. And so we have many bats, they occupy a variety of roosts, and they are distributed across the entire planet. So they also occupy virtually all terrestrial environments, where they represent a significant part of the biodiversity, and particularly of the mammals that are present there. In fact, more or less half of the mammals we find in the rainforests of South America, in the Amazon and the Atlantic forest, are bats. In the Amazon, we get about 100 species of bats in the same single location, which is a huge local diversity, huge diversity per site. And for you, maybe for you better to understand the scale I'm talking about, when we talk about a mammal, in the whole of Europe, there are just over 50 species of bats. So it's huge local diversity in these South American rainforests. Also, a difference we find from the neotropics to the temperate region of including Europe and most of North America is that in Europe and in North America, bats feed almost exclusively on insects. And here in South America, many species also feed on insects, but there are also species that feed on fruits, on nectar, others on vertebrates, such as other bats they catch while flying, birds, lizards, frogs. We even have a species that's specialized on eating fish that it catches with its hind legs. And finally, we have 3 species, possibly the most notorious, that feed on blood of other animals, the famous vampire bats. But these are only 3 species in this huge South American diversity, and these are the only 3 species in the world, in fact. So, in other words, George said I was bitten by the Brazilian bug, but the fact is that here we have the perfect mix, the perfect group of species to understand how species appear and disappear and go extinct, and how this diversity is arranged, is sorted between environments and within the environments, and how these different organisms, bats, between them and with other organisms, how these organisms interact. And it's precisely because bats are so many and very different from each other, from one another, that they are amazing to answer the questions that fascinate me, but I think that fascinate most people and most biologists. And the first of these questions is how rich and how varied is life on Earth, which is obviously terribly ambitious. But we use bats as models, and particularly these very diverse bats of South America. And one of the first questions we pose is what are the processes, the mechanisms that are responsible for this amazing bat diversity we have here in South and Central America and across the world, as a matter of fact? Well, there is something that all bats have that is very different from all the other mammals. And it's probably behind this great diversification across the world. You may have already guessed, it's the ability to fly. So being able to fly and to fly great distances for sure contributed to this diversification and distribution around the world. Flight is a unique feature of bats among mammals, and this is very important. So the increase in this dispersal ability in an animal that it's not very big has exposed bats to many different selection pressures. And let's think from an evolutionary point of view. When a given group of organisms arrives and invades a new environment, what happens is that there is an adaptation to that new environment, to the new opportunities, to the new constraints that exist there. And this adaptation is possible through the emergence of what we call key innovations. Something has to be new for that organism to invade a new environment. And bats, the present hypothesis is that bats probably originated in the territory that today is North America, but through flight they were able to arrive in different regions of the planet and established different adaptations to these different environments where they arrived. And in regions like here in South America, there is a huge diversity of environments. The climate is more or less stable, and therefore the production of flowers and fruits is also kind of constant throughout the year. And from that ancestral bat species, which probably fed on insects, emerged key innovations that allowed bats to explore these different resources. So based on a variability of individuals of these ancestral species, animals with, for example, a more robust skull and larger canines can explore, in addition to insects, can explore eventually a small vertebrate. Animals with robust skulls and more developed molars can explore tougher fruits. Animals with a longer tongue can try to feed on the nectar hidden inside the flowers. And over time, these changes become fixed in the populations. And what would be an original population with a diversity of individuals eventually separates in different species and in different lineages. And what is incredible here in South America, and this occurs all across the world, of course, but what is incredible here in South America is that these key innovations in bats were a lot. And they emerged in evolutionary time very quickly, in a few million years. And some of our work has shown that this rate of speciation of new species appearing is not decreasing. In fact, in some groups, this rate of the emergence of new species even seems to be increasing. And what you see, I promise I only brought a couple of graphs, but what you see in these graphs very quickly is the rate of emergence of new species over the past 40 million years. And in a particular lineage that's in the graph, one bat family, the Vespertilionidae, the rate of species emergence has been increasing for the last 20 million years, and is going up. Of course, we have other problems, the speed and intensity with which we have been changing the planet and the environment, but we'll talk about that further on. So how do these species distribute across the different environments we have here? Let's return to the opportunities that flight created. And before I knew that George was going to be here, I had decided to put this image and these references because it's from my PhD, which he supervised. But let's go back to the opportunities that flight created. To be able to fly not only allowed the continental exploration in a large scale, but also a finer specialization in the different environments. And flight allowed a real three-dimensional 3D exploration of the environment. So you imagine a single-story house or a skyscraper. In a skyscraper, a lot of people can coexist simultaneously. And that's what happens with bats, especially in rainforests. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that half of the species of mammals in tropical forests are bats. And one of the mechanisms that explains this richness is exactly this possibility of distributing the species in this vertical dimension, which is not always possible in other groups of animals or organisms. And particularly here, the many and distinct vertical forest strata open up the possibility of exploring different niches, different environments in height by different bat species. So when you take, for example, this picture that was taken in the Amazon, sometimes we have trees that reach 50, 60, 70 meters height. And some of our work, in fact, with George and João Tiago Marques, has showed that we have bats typical of different vertical strata. So we have bats that are typical of the understory that, for example, roost on smaller trees or feed on resources that are near the ground. For example, the frog-eating bats that catch frogs on the ground, or the bat species that forage on fruits of short shrubs. And on the other hand, we have species that are typical of the canopy or even the strata above the canopy of the trees that eat fruits that ripen on top of very tall trees, or that feed, for example, on insects, on moths that are dragged very high by atmospheric currents. So you have this vertical exploration of forests, particularly of forest environments, but not restricted to forest environments. And flight and key innovations also allow the bats to explore the environmental mosaic that you find in a given region. For example, in this work in the Pantanal, we found that the bat species, the bat communities, they respond to very subtle vegetation gradients. And this is the second graph, I promise, and the last one. Here you see the proportional abundance of bat species throughout the sites we surveyed, according to a gradient from more forested environments to more grassy, more fields, more field type environments. And it's quite evident that the densely forested sites present higher richness and abundance of some species, particularly of a family of bats that's restricted here to the neotropics, the phylostomids. And within these, we see that frugivores and carnivores clearly prefer forests, while those bats that feed on insects that they catch while flying, which we call the aerial insectivore bats, they need open spaces. So they prefer and are much more common in open environments. And then related to this question of how species distribute across the different environments, we obviously want to know what are the impacts of anthropogenic landscape changes on bat diversity. And unfortunately, Brazil has championed the destruction of the most biodiverse environments on the planet. The Amazonia, the Cerrado, which is a savanna here, typical of South America, of Brazil in particular, the Pantanal, which is quite famous, and the Caatinga, perhaps not so well known for non-Brazilians, which is a more or less arid environment exclusive to Northeast Brazil, the Atlantic forest, where most of the Brazilian population lives, and even the Pampa fields here in the south, close to me at the moment. And this slide, I'm sorry, it's in Portuguese, but it's from the materials of the Map Biomas initiative in Brazil that has been tracking a landscape change for the last decades. What it shows is that between 1985 and 2019, Brazil has lost 87 million hectares of native land to intensive agriculture and livestock production. And much of this area, especially in the recent years, has been illegally devastated. And this obviously affects bats and affects all the environments that roost bats, including caves and other organisms that occur in those areas. And caves and cave protection legislation is a hot topic nowadays in Brazil, not for good reasons, in fact. In last September, Brazil's Ministry of Mines and Energy announced a new mining plan, which supposedly improved regulations on caves, but what in reality, what it makes is it contemplates an expansion of mining activities and mining, for example, on indigenous lands and protected areas, and particularly the buffer zones of protected areas, which is nowadays is still prohibited by law. So what you see on the top map are the areas, the present mining locations, what we have, and on the map in the bottom is the present mining activity plus the planned mining activities. This is represented in black in both maps, and all the other colors represent conservation areas of different types and indigenous lands. So the plan is a huge increase of area occupied by mining. And this certainly affects caves and all the associated fauna including obviously bats. And for bats, this is particularly serious because while there is an estimate of for the existence of over 300,000 caves in Brazil, only 20,000 are registered in the national database. And of the 181 species of bats presently recognized as occurring in Brazil, almost half, 72, have been recorded in caves, and many of them depend completely of caves. Indeed, in the last evaluation of the conservation status of Brazilian bats that joined a large group of friends and bat specialists in Brazil, we found that all Brazilian bat species categorized as threatened are fully dependent or somehow associated to caves and the surrounding environments. For example, this small bat here is Loncophila de Keizeri, is the cerrado nectar-eating bat, in Portuguese is morceguinho do cerrado, is endangered and is completely cave dependent. And all the other species that you see here that are categorized as vulnerable are affected by roosting and foraging habitat loss, and all affected by mining and by the destruction of potential roosts, particularly the caves. So going back to the map, biomas maps, what we have been working, a lot of bat specialists here in Brazil, myself included, what we have been working in almost all the environments. And as George said, during my PhD, I worked in the Amazon. Then in my postdoc, I worked in the Cerrado and the Pantanal. And since I joined here, the university, we have been working in the Atlantic forest and more recently in the Pampa. And unfortunately, all these environments, all of them, have lost huge amounts of native areas. So when we transform a native forest into a pasture or a savanna into a monoculture, what we lose is environmental complexity, that variability that we see in the rainforests, even the 3D variability. And all our work points out to the following direction. Losing that complexity, we lose species, and we lose species that are ecologically very different. That is, they provide different services for the ecosystems and for us. And we call this loss of functional diversity, because not only we lose the species, but we lose the function that it's played by them or by that species in the ecosystem. And in bats and many other groups, in many times it's not replaced, or it's not present, that function, it's not present in any other organism. And in addition to this loss of species and functions, we also lose evolutionary histories, different evolutionary histories, millions of years of evolutionary history. And we call this loss of phylogenetic diversity. And we have been working a lot on this subject. So when we destroy, for example, a tropical forest for cattle production, or we transform a savanna into a soy monoculture, what we see immediately, even with very slight changes, it's an immediate loss of species. And initially we start by losing more specialized species dependent on one or two roosting or foraging resources, and shelter and food. And when we lose those specialized bats, we start to lose the other species that are closely related to them. For example, a plant that is exclusively pollinated by a bat, that exists, and we'll see in a few minutes. So when you look at these interaction networks, for example, this is an interaction between bats in blue and plants in orange. So when you look at these interaction networks, what happens is when moving from a more preserved or scarcely modified environment, when you move to a monoculture or to a land that was degraded, for example, by a mining accident, as occurred here a couple of times, very serious accidents with mines, we lose a lot of species and we lose a lot of these connections. And the question is, so what? And that's a question that we that work in conservation hear too often. For many years, we have been hearing this question of, so what? So we lose bats, so what? And if we want to answer it from a strictly utilitarian point of view, how does this loss of species and interactions affect us? Well, as some of you probably know, this enormous diversity of species and ecological strategies in bats is reflected on the socio-economical importance of these organisms, and particularly on the services they provide to ecosystems and to us, to humans. And so imagine if we have bats, we have a lot of bats that feed on nectar. And then we have pollinating bats that carry pollen between flowers and are fundamental vectors for the reproduction of hundreds of species of plants that have commercial value. The best known example is of a pollination service carried out by bats is the pollination of the agave, the plant that is the basis of tequila. Probably a lot of us like tequila. And this is an example from North America, from Mexico. But here in South America, and Brazil in particular, we have many other examples and of huge importance for the Brazilian economy. A nice example is the pollination of passiflora. Passiflora are the passion fruits. And some passion fruit species in the photo in the top are exclusively pollinated by bats because they have co-evolved in such a way that only bats are able to extract the nectar and simultaneously carry pollen on their snouts or on their fur and transport it to other passion fruits and to other flowers of passion fruits. And another typical example, a Brazilian example, is the pollination of pequi and pequia. I don't know how to translate this to English, so I'll call it pequi and pequia. And these are fruits of some trees that you either love or hate them. I love them, but I eat anything, so I'm not a good example. But these fruits are widely consumed in the Midwest and North Brazil, and they are both pollinated by bats. So it's easy to predict what happens to these species of plants if they don't have their exclusive or predominant pollinators around, and these pollinators are bats. So if we lose these pollinators, we're probably going to lose some of these plants, or at least some of the economic value of these plants. And also, because we have species that essentially feed on fruits, they are responsible for seed dispersal. And because bats catch the fruit, they carry the fruit on their mouths and they disperse in the environment. And so they usually drop the seeds, or they digest the fruit, and then they put the seed out with their feces. So associated to this seed dispersal, they are also essential to habitat regeneration. And the United Nations Environmental Program estimates that about 95% of tropical forest regeneration is carried out by bats. Not least because some of those seeds do not germinate if they do not pass through the digestive tract of these animals. And another well-known and extremely important service that bats provides us is the control of insects that are agricultural pests. And it is estimated that the value of the service provided by bats in the control of these pests is greater than 50 billion euro annually. This is a lot of money. And there is recent evidence of their importance as regulators of insects that are vectors of diseases for people and for domestic animals. And another thing that we can get from bats and that we can learn from bats, this links to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many studies on bats and viruses have shown that bats are highly resistant to viral infections, but they don't show the typical inflammatory response that is a response to fight the infection, and that occurs in many other animals, including us. This inflammation is part of that response, but above certain levels, it can contribute to cell death, it can contribute to aging. And what seems to happen in bats is that they respond to the infection, but they mitigate this inflammation, which makes them excellent models for understanding how to deal with viral infections. Also, and there is a lot of recent work revising these subjects. One of these papers explained that genetic and self-repairing DNA mechanisms that are unique to bats seem to explain another spectacular feature that bats have. Bats live much longer than other vertebrates of the same size. And they don't seem vulnerable to age-related diseases. So they grow old, but they don't get the diseases associated to age. And so again, they are perfect models in studies to delay aging or to treat diseases associated to age in humans. And bats also show low vulnerability to cancer. The oral microflora of some bat species seems to decrease their vulnerability to cavities. So all of these features in bats are absolutely amazing. So bats, and of course, all biodiversity cannot continue to be seen as potential reservoirs of diseases, but rather as an integral part of the biodiversity of our planet, and still as source of very useful information for us from the medical point of view. So we are losing species that apparently that sustain our lives. And with this, I went back to the libraries. We are losing an immense library of solutions that was already tested by evolution and that solved countless challenges that are being posed to us nowadays. And this is very worrying because we are talking about an ethical dimension that in itself should be more than enough to modify our way of life. But there is also an aesthetic, an ethnic, and even spiritual dimension, as well as those social and economical dimensions that are involved when we lose species. All knowledge accumulated so far, and I brought this because we are living the COVID presently, but all accumulated knowledge shows that many pandemics, or probably most of them, do not result from the direct presence of the animals, and even less from high levels of biodiversity, but from those human impacts on the ecosystem and in the natural environment. And indeed, the reduction, the decrease in the number of species and their habitats seems to promote the spread of zoonotic diseases. And many studies point out that when biodiversity is high, in other words, when we have several species that are potential hosts for the same virus or its variants, the rate of encounter between infected individuals and individuals likely to be infected decreases. And this is called the dilution effects, because it's like the virus are diluted across many potential species. And these authors in that reference that they propose that the extinction, for example, of large Pleistocene mammals, mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and others, those extinctions appear to have led to an increase in zoonotic diseases in humans. The development model that we insist on following is certainly the cause of what we are living nowadays and the environmental imbalance that we are witnessing. And if we continue to act in the same way, we will receive more pandemics in the years to come. So we need to change our action on the planet. But good things, particularly related to bats, seem to be happening. At the beginning of the pandemic, a year ago, we were invaded by a lot of literature. Some of that we can even call it literature, but with a lot of inaccurate information. Sometimes the main text was correct, but with very unfortunate headlines. And a year later, or a few months later, and now particularly, we are moving on to news about bats' ecological relevance and how they are fundamental for research oriented towards human disease and aging. So I think it's my personal opinion that things are changing a little bit, at least in the last couple of months. And for example, it's in Portuguese again, but this is an example of a material produced by the Brazilian Ministry of Health that, despite its total lack of governmental leadership, still maintains amazing professionals. And so for those that don't understand Portuguese, it basically says that the new coronavirus came from bats and snakes, and the stamp says, "This is fake news, stop spreading." So we are trying to change people's perception on biodiversity. And even here in Brazil, and in the last couple of years, sometimes we feel that we are going back to the dark ages. Even so, we have been able to gain some important space next to the general public. And as Brazilian Bat Research Society, Enrico Bernard and I, we wrote a piece in Folha de São Paulo, which is the largest Brazilian newspaper, on the theme of bats and COVID. And it was released right during the World Environmental Day. So for a couple of days, it was one of the most read articles. And this is very good. Somehow we are reaching people. I'm finishing, I promise. Let me finish and let's finish thinking about where to go next. As serious as losing bat diversity, or perhaps more serious, is losing it without even knowing it yet. And recently, we tried to predict where new bat species are most likely to be found here in the huge Brazilian territory. And in fact, a significant part of Brazil has never been sampled for bats. And what we did was look at the features of the environments where new species have been described in the last years. And we found that these features are relatively different from the places where species have been described the longest. And then we crossed these places with more distinct features with a human footprint map. And so we predicted regions where there is a high probability of finding new bat species, not yet known to science, but that they are probably already threatened by human action. And those priority locations are those here marked in the map in darker red. And they coincide with the location of the map of potential caves in Brazil, and with the probably over 150,000 unknown caves in karst areas, still to be discovered. So the message is that biologists have a lot of work to do, but also that they should be joined by researchers on caves and other cave animals and other organisms and geologists. I brought a very short video that I want to show you. Okay, before finishing, let me give you the deserved credits for this video. The idea and the art of this video was conceived by Adriana Arias Aguilar. She's the SPECS coordinator for the Pampa region, and she is my PhD student. And the video was edited by Cynthia da Costa, who's the coordinator of the communication office at SPEC. And coincidentally, my master's student, so I grab all the good ones. And if you want to know more about bats, before I finish, and South American bats in particular, please subscribe the Brazilian Bat Society, social media, but mainly YouTube, the YouTube channel, and watch the lives we organized during 2020. When everyone was basically at home, in a project that we called At Home with Bats, and where we received many bat specialists talking mostly, or if not all in Portuguese, but many bat specialists talking about different subjects, and conceived by the SBEC's education coordinator, Henrique Filho, and developed by him and Cynthia, who were the hosts of these weekly lives. So I want to finish with this beautiful, beautiful video that Adriana set up. So this is what I had prepared for you today. I would like to thank all my collaborators in Brazil and every institution that has hosted me, and in particularly my wonderful team at the lab and all people at the Brazilian Bat Research Society for letting me be part of this amazing group of bat specialists, conservationists, above all bat lovers. And it's a huge pleasure to work and to learn with every one of them. And again, to thank this invitation by Ana Sofia, the Cave Show, and particularly the Center for Ecology, Evolution and Environmental Changes, Jorge, and the Faculty of Sciences of Lisbon. That is my alma mater. So it's lovely to be back, even if online. Thanks to every one of you out there. I hope you're still there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria João, for this amazing talk about bats. I guess when we talk about caves and we talk about cave explorers, I think even though we are not bat researchers, we are all bat lovers, or at least most of us are bat lovers. So thank you. It was an amazing talk, and we have some questions from the public. So Marta will kindly ask you those questions. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you once again, Maria João. It was an amazing talk. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So we have already one question from the public by Radu Stingen. He asks, can you share any interesting practices from groups or organizations that have contributed to better protection of bats and caves? For example, in Europe, it's interesting to see the greater role played by touristic or show caves in spreading real information about bats and their ecological importance.
Well, here in Brazil, in particularly, not only the Brazilian Bat Research Society has been working on trying to stop and, in fact, in really trying to improve this legislation on cave protection, but we have a governmental agency, which is the SECAV. It's a specific governmental agency that works on the protection. It's from the Ministry of Environment, and that works with the protection of caves. And recently, for example, we were able to receive some funds that were attributed to this center, to SECAV, to give scholarships for people working with bats, including in caves and associated to cave protection. So I invite you to visit the ICM Bio, Instituto Chico Mendes para a Biodiversidade of the Ministry of Environment in Brazil. There are also a lot of associations, and particularly the Brazilian Speleological Association is also working very closely to us at SBEC. So this, at least in Brazil, these are some of the best examples of associations and of people working in caves. We have quite a few amazingly beautiful caves here in Brazil that are visited. And at least in some regions, this visitation is quite well managed and controlled by the environmental agents. For instance, if it's inside the conservation unit defines, for example, how many people can visit per day. So things work reasonably well, and we have a very progressive legislation on biodiversity and on cave protection. The problem is the things that we are living nowadays that seems to try, they seem to be trying to take back that nice legislation and that those groups that work on caves and on cave protection.
Thank you, Maria João. Sophia, I think you also have a question, right?
Yes, I do have a question. So now I would like to know your opinion, because for more than 1 year, we've been living this pandemic situation that throw us all into our homes and that change our lifestyle completely worldwide. And we know the scientific evidences that we have is that probably this COVID-19, the virus that causes this disease, came from a bat, or a jump from a bat to another animal. Mm-hmm. So my question is, if the bats are, let's say, the source of the problem, are they also the solution? Should we look for the solution for the problem in bats as well?
I think they may be part of the solution for the reasons I presented before. And I don't think they are really the part of the problem. All of us are animals and we are all mammals. So we share a lot of things. And one of the things we share is virus and diseases. So we can also be virus reservoirs that we take to other species. That has happened a lot in the history of humans, where we, for example, some populations of a region of the world took viruses that have co-evolved with them for a long time to other populations that had not co-evolved. So there's no way of escaping that we all share an evolutionary history. And of course, we're going to share a lot of things. The problem is that when some of these viruses pass from bats or other animals to humans, immediately we are trying to see a culprit and to condemn a given group, a certain group. And so what we are seeing is that it's the wrong acts of humans, the way that we are changing landscapes and that we are invading landscapes in a very unsustainable way that is creating these unbalances. And of course, sometimes we're going to get pandemics, and sometimes we're going, and probably we're going to have another pandemic even worse than this one. So we are now living it. It seems really awful. It is awful. A lot of people have died. But if we don't change the way we act on the planet, then it's a given fact that it's going to happen again. And so I don't see animals or biodiversity as a part of the problem. I think it's inevitable. Virus can be considered part of biodiversity. They also appear and disappear, bacteria as well, other organisms that most of them, most virus, most bacteria, most fungi do not cause diseases. It's a very small part of those organisms that cause diseases, but sometimes we have some that cause diseases. And so we have to change our way on the planet, and we have to start looking at the human health as something that is indivisible from the environmental health and from all the other fauna and all the other organisms' health. So we can separate one thing from the other. So if we're going to destroy a lot of, let's imagine, well, let's kill all the bats. So we're going to create so many imbalances in the planet that the situation is going to be much worse, because they are part of the solution as all other animals and probably all other organisms on the planet. This is my very personal opinion, but that's the way I see it.
Thank you. George, I think you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Before the question, thank you very much for a fascinating talk about a fascinating topic, bats. You mentioned that cave-dwelling bats are the most threatened group in Brazil. You mentioned that there were problems with mining, but what are the other problems that are affecting caves and through caves are affecting the populations of cave-dwelling bats in South America?
Well, mostly mining, but also environmental destruction around caves. The thing is that cave bats in Brazil and probably in a lot of parts of the world are best known than other bat species. And for example, we have almost 30 species in Brazil for which we are data deficient. And most of these are not cave dwelling, or some are, but some are not. So we don't know if there are other species even more threatened than those that we found in the last workshop. But mining is a huge problem. Then you have a lot of other human activities, not only the direct destruction or habitat conversion, but for example, the building of hydroelectric dams, which is still a huge source of energy in Brazil. And so we are not changing our, for example, our energetic matrix for other types of energy. Of course, we have now some problems that are going to start to appear associated to wind farms, inland and offshore, but mostly those, the destruction of the environment surrounding caves, mining, and other kind of very destructive infrastructures, such as dams, which destroy huge amounts of habitat.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria João. We have one final question on the chat, which I think also meets a little bit of aspects that we have mentioned before, but just to complement if you have further comments. It's a comment by Frederico Hintze. He says, great talk as always, and he asks, what are the main challenges that you think we as researchers will face to convince the general public to improve on the protection of caves and cavinical bats?
Difficult question, Fred. Hi there. Well, I think the biggest challenge is to show that, for example, when we talk about mining, we are talking about what people think that is going to be further richness and further economic development for the country. So I think what we need, politically speaking, what we need to change is this idea that only destructive actions can be valuable economically. So we need to show that, for example, Brazil as an ecotourist value, unexplored value, in an immense ecotourism potential value, and it's not even close to be fully explored. And so what we have here, we first need to solve other things that are beyond that research responsibility. But we have a lot of inequality in Brazil, and so people think that when they have a mine nearby, that this is going to bring a lot of money for their region. So we need to make people understand that we can have a more sustainable way of life, and this will include bats and bat conservation, of course. That this will be favorable for bats, but for the entire biodiversity. And we can have added value using different development models. And this is a challenge that I think, well, George is working in this like for over 40 years. I'm working on these subjects for over 20 years, and it's really, really complicated. But we don't give up, and we keep on fighting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have one final question, and I would suggest, because we are reaching the end of the predicted time for our session, a briefer answer if possible. So it's a question.
I'll try.
It's a challenge. So we have a question by Mariana Azeredo, and she asks, how do you think we can promote or reconcile pest control done by bats, which has been seen as significant from an ecosystem service perspective and financial, and the fear of zoonosis emergency?
Ooh, that's difficult. We have to work a lot on environmental education, but we can show good examples from other places in the world. So we have a lot of good examples, especially from, well, some from the neotropics and some from North America, where farmers understood the importance of bats, and they are not destroying bats. And recently, it came out a piece that was written by bat conservationists and farmers in the United States, explaining that bats are not directly associated to the pandemic, this pandemic in particular, and that they are incredibly important for pest control. So I think we need to continue to pass on the message and to give good examples that already exist in the world. Faster than this, I can't.
Thank you so much, Maria João. Thank you for accepting this invitation to be here with us, and thank you for your brilliant, as usual, talk.
Oh, thank you so much.
To you several other times before, and it's always an amazing pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here with us and for seeing us later on YouTube. We have more questions, but we exceeded already the time we have.
I'll go there.
So maybe Maria João can see the questions on the chat and reply afterwards. So the next cave show will be about the classical karst and about the caves of the classical karst. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon again. Have a good evening.